Imagine you're standing on a pitch-black, frozen Norwegian plateau in the absolute dead of winter. The wind is howling, you're freezing, and your commanding officer walks up, looks you dead in the eye, and hands you a suicide capsule. Welcome to this explainer. We're jumping straight into the middle of a World War II operation that honestly sounds like a rejected script for an insane Hollywood heist movie. This isn't about massive armies colliding. It's about a tiny handful of everyday guys who were asked to pull off the literally impossible. It's 1943. The Allies are looking at intelligence reports and realizing, to their absolute horror, that the Nazis are terrifyingly close to building an atomic bomb. Their solution? That's where our freezing guys on skis come in. An obscure Norwegian chemistry professor is casually handing out cyanide pills to a bunch of 20-somethings. They're about to drop into a mission so wildly dangerous, the British command back in London assumes right from the start that they're never coming back. And here's the wildest part of this whole setup. These commandos? They had absolutely zero idea they were saving the entire world from nuclear annihilation. Colonel Leif Tronstad, the chemistry professor running the briefing, wasn't allowed to breathe a single word about atomic fission or bombs. These guys just knew they had to blow up a heavily guarded chemical plant, and they knew that if the Gestapo caught them, it meant brutal torture and execution. Hence, the pills. Okay, so what exactly were they hunting? We need to do just a tiny bit of science here. To make their raw uranium go boom, the Nazi physicists were desperate for a highly specific, magically rare ingredient called heavy water. It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's water, but the hydrogen atoms have an extra neutron, which makes it incredibly dense. Literally, if you made ice cubes out of heavy water, they wouldn't float. They'd sink straight to the bottom of your glass like rocks. This right here is the massive, glowing Achilles heel of the entire Nazi nuclear program. You might be wondering, why did the Germans need this weird heavy water when the Americans didn't? Well, the U.S. Manhattan Project was using enriched uranium and graphite. But the Germans? They were stuck using unenriched uranium. And to get unenriched uranium to achieve critical mass, you absolutely have to have heavy water to slow down the fast-moving neutrons. Without it, the Nazi atomic bomb was just a terrifying math equation on a chalkboard. Which brings us to the Allies' massive problem. Heavy water is ridiculously rare in nature. You have to synthesize it. And the only place in all of Europe producing this stuff on a commercial scale was a practically impenetrable superfortress called the Vemork plant. The Germans had seized it back in 1940 and cranked production into overdrive. And this place was a nightmare to attack. It was literally carved into the side of a freezing sheer cliff face in the Telemark region of occupied Norway. So how do you destroy an icy cliffside fortress? Well, in late 1942, the British military tried to use brute force with Operation Freshman. They loaded up 34 Royal Engineers into heavy wooden gliders, packed them with weapons, and, wait for it, bicycles. Yes, actual bicycles, to somehow ride through a Norwegian mountain blizzard. Meanwhile, the local Norwegian advance team, known as Operation Gross, had just parachuted onto the frozen plateau, surviving for months using cross-country skis and literally living off whatever wild reindeer they could hunt. Tragically, that British plan, Operation Freshman, was a total, unmitigated disaster. The winter weather was absolute hell, the navigation failed, and the heavy gliders crashed violently into the mountains. Every single one of the 41 men involved was either killed in the horrific wreckage, or they were captured by the Gestapo and immediately executed. It gets worse. In the wreckage of those gliders, the Germans found a map. They instantly realized Vemork was the target. The element of surprise was completely 100% gone. The Germans swept the area with 200 armed Gestapo agents and turned the plant into an absolute death trap. They laid down minefields, rigged up booby traps, threw floodlights on the roof, and strung massive steel cables across the valley just to shred any low-flying Allied bombers. The fortress was now locked down tight. With the plant on ultra-high alert, the British Special Operations Executive realized a massive military assault was now totally off the table. They needed a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. So they decided to send in a tiny covert team of Norwegian locals, codenamed Operation Gunnerside. And who were these elite, world-saving commandos? They were led by Joachim Rennerberg, a 23-year-old kid with practically zero military experience outside of some basic secret agent training. The rest of his squad? A local school teacher, a postman, and a literal tour guide. Just incredibly brave, ordinary guys who absolutely refused to let their country stay occupied. So the Germans are heavily guarding the only bridge into the plant, right? They're assuming any attack has to come straight across it or from the sky. But our Norwegian squad decides to completely ignore the bridge. Their actual plan? They are going to descend into a 300-foot frozen gorge that the German command had officially classified as impassable. They'd cross the half-frozen river at the bottom. In pitch darkness, free climb 300 feet of sheer icy cliff straight up to the factory walls and sneak inside using blueprints smuggled out by the resistance. And you know what? They actually pulled it off. It is mind-blowing. They scaled a sheer ice wall in the dead of night, slipped right past the German sentries, found the heavy water production room, and strapped timed explosives directly to the machinery. They lit the fuses and vanished back out into the screaming snowstorm right as the entire room blew sky high. Ronenberg later said the whole thing went like a dream. They completely shattered Hitler's heavy water supply, and they didn't fire a single bullet to do it. Take a look at this quote. It perfectly captures the mindset of these everyday guys. After the explosion, all hell broke loose. The team scattered. To survive, they had to pull off a brutal 400-mile cross-country ski escape through some of the most unforgiving winter terrain on the planet, dodging massive German search parties the entire way until they finally crossed the border into neutral Sweden. They fought for that glass boat every single day. But if you think the Nazis just gave up, you'd be wrong. Over the next several months, the Germans painstakingly repaired the damage. The Allies tried sending hundreds of American heavy bombers to wipe the valley off the map, but Vemork's massive concrete walls barely flinched. The Germans, however, realized they couldn't risk another commando raid. They decided to pack up every single drop of their heavy water into steel drums and ship it straight back to Germany. This triggered an absolute panic in London. The British War Cabinet sent a gut-wrenching, urgent order down to a Norwegian commando named Knut Haukelid, who was still operating behind enemy lines. He was handed one final, desperate mission. He had to intercept and sink the SF Hydro, a civilian ferry that was going to transport the heavy water across Lake Tinn. He had to send it to the bottom before it ever reached the Nazis. Haukelid managed to sneak aboard that ferry and hide explosives deep down in the bilge. On February 20th, 1944, right as the boat crossed over the absolute deepest part of the lake, the charges blew. The ferry tore apart and plummeted 1,300 feet to the bottom, taking Hitler's atomic dreams down with it forever. But it came at a terrible, sobering cost. Alongside a few German guards, 14 innocent Norwegian civilians drowned in those freezing waters. It was a horrifying price to pay, but one the Allies deemed absolutely necessary to stop a far greater evil. When you look at this timeline, it is just staggering to comprehend the sheer, relentless willpower of the Norwegian resistance and the Allied forces. From those early scouts freezing on a barren plateau, through the heartbreaking glider crash, to a midnight free climb up an ice wall, and finally the tragic sinking of a civilian ferry. They simply refused to quit, even when everything went wrong and the odds were completely impossible. And that unbelievable sacrifice is exactly what paid off. By starving the German physicists of the heavy water they desperately needed, a bunch of young guys on skis single-handedly crippled the Nazi nuclear program. They delayed the Germans by months, which guaranteed that Hitler could never build an atomic bomb before the war in Europe came to an end. It gave the U.S. Manhattan Project the crucial time it needed to pull ahead and ultimately win the atomic race. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a genuinely chilling thought. History is incredibly fragile. Think about how completely different our world might look today if a local tour guide, a postman, and a school teacher hadn't looked at a freezing 300-foot ice cliff in the dead of night and decided to climb it. It's wild to think about, but sometimes the fate of the entire world doesn't actually rely on massive armies. Sometimes it just takes a few brave underdogs with some stolen blueprints, some explosives, and a really good pair of skis.